Hi Year 12, this video is going to walk through the social structure of Pompeii and Herculaneum. There are the terms. Once again, you can pause it if you need to slow it down and go through some of those, but I'll be using some of those terms throughout the presentation. Okay, so an introduction. Pompeii and Herculaneum are pretty typical of other Roman towns. We see a lot of class division, we see a lot of rigid social structures in place. It's very much patriarchal. Women roughly get the same rights as slaves at this time. If you're being really specific, women really occupy between the freedmen and slaves. So the familia, the idea of the familia is really important in society. The father takes the head of the family, known as the pater familia, and the idea of the familia, or the household, included your family members and the slaves, or could include the slaves if your family happened to own them. So the broad categories that we're going to go over today are the freeborn, the freedmen and freedwomen, and the slaves. But we've also got other distinctions between citizens, so peoples, that is, you can have citizens and non-citizens, and privileged and non-privileged. What that essentially means is you might actually, so all freeborns have the right to vote, but not all of them can stand for office. Okay, so, and it was very rare that you could, start as a slave and work your way up. It was very rare for that to happen. Okay, so we start right at the top, and this graph here is going to appear in most of the slides. So we start right at the top, which is the senatorial elite. As you can see, they are freeborns, which essentially means they're not born a slave. They are right at the top. They're not in, when it says they're not involved in the local politics, that means they're not really there to, they're not worried about Pompeii and Herculaneum. They're visiting from the capital, usually to holiday in Pompeii or Herculaneum, because remember, they're like tropical or not tropical, but lovely destinations to get away to. So they're not really getting too involved in local politics. We've definitely got more evidence we're going to go over in class, but here's just a picture of one. This is an excavated villa known as the Villa of Oplontis. Okay, so it's pretty schmick. Okay, next down is the local elite. As you can see, again, they're also freeborn, okay? They're very close to the top, and the local elite are made of the wealthy landowners and merchants. They are often involved in the local politics, but to run for office, you had to be freeborn. You could not have been a slave and been freed. You had to have been a freeborn to run for office. Okay, so even if you're a freedman that made the elite because you became very successful, you wouldn't be able to get involved in politics, but we go over that in a second. The local elite often had large villas outside the city and the city walls. They're generally concerned with the selling of their estates and business, so some could even rent out their own houses to smaller businessmen. Again, our evidence can be in the form of villas, but many of the local elite actually try and run to be a politician in the town. So we see like graffiti and kind of campaign slogans and stuff, or campaign kind of ads, or people trying to support them, okay? And we also find epitaphs on their tombs after they've passed away about what they've accomplished. Alright, super quick, you've got the populace, which are essentially your freeborn males of Roman background who are citizens, but they're not wealthy, or they're not really running for office or anything like that. So they could vote, they make up your everyday kind of workers. Okay, we get to the freedmen. So essentially, if you were a slave, sometimes you could actually, it was fairly common that you could be freed. Sometimes your master would free you, which was a process called manumission, or you could save up enough to essentially buy your freedom. It was very, very often that even when you became a freedman or a freedwoman, many would actually remain with their master family and just continue working with them. And sometimes it seemed like it was actually a really nice relationship. Some even masters that had a slave and then they became freedmen, bought their graves and, gave them really nice inscriptions on their tomb after they passed away. The freedmen are incredibly important for the economy. generally they're doing the really unpopular roles, like working in the fulleries and some of the work that, your regular citizens don't really want to do. But some freedmen and freedwomen, for that matter, can actually become really, really wealthy, and they do, with their own business. So, as I said, they can't vote and they can't run for office, but their children, once they're a freedman, can actually, because their children are freeborn, their children can run for office. So we see many wealthy freedmen actually using their money to try and advance their son's political career. Okay, so we've got a very quick one here. If you remember covering the Fullery of Stephanus, the ancient laundromat, we would have seen slaves and freedmen and women working in that. This is the villa of Aulus Umbricius Scaurus. If you remember, we spoke about the fish sauce that Pompey was renowned for. Aulus was the most famous, or the number one manufacturer of garum in Pompeii, and he was actually a freedman who became extremely wealthy enough to build his own villa, which was a very fancy villa. Okay, so we're on to slaves now. So slaves are found in every aspect of society. We're essentially right at the bottom now. They're the economic backbone. They do your domestic tasks. They do your unskilled labor. Now, men, women, and children could actually own slaves, and there's transactions that we have on wax tablets and bill of sales on the transaction of slaves, and they can actually be passed through inheritance. There's also, just on a side note, we believe there was potentially a bit of a hierarchy amongst slaves as well. Some slaves could actually be trusted to run the master's funds, and some of them are just responsible for getting food and that kind of stuff. And when we get to gladiators, most gladiators were also slaves, so they're essentially bought and thrown into the arena to fight. Here's a quick back to here's a fresco in the Fullery of Stephanus, which depicts some slaves working in the fulleries. Okay, we also have found some statues of slaves and some shackles, which suggests slaves could have been chained. Okay, so we are on women now. So generally, as I said, women occupy a position between slaves and freedmen. There's variations for women depending on whether you were a freeborn or whether you weren't, and also the amount of wealth you had. So for women particularly, power came from wealth. And as I said, women can own slaves. So if you were a freeborn woman, you could not vote, you could not stand for office, but we've actually found evidence of women being quite interested in their local politics and trying to play a role, but we'll go over that in a future lesson. What we definitely see is some freeborn women who were very, very successful businesswomen. So they were allowed to have their own business and become wealthy in their own right. We've got some knowledge of women playing a role as state priestesses, essentially responsible for construction and dedication of public buildings. Wealthier freeborn women may have remained at home, whereas poorer freeborn women may have worked in various occupations outside of the home, potentially in the fulleries and stuff as well. We've got freed women. Female slaves could be freed as well. The wives of freedmen may help their husbands in their business. As I said, some of them, freed women, could also run their own businesses and potentially become extremely wealthy. And slave women. Slave women are not permitted to marry, and if a slave woman had children, according to Roman law, they belonged to the master. So also remember, when we spoke about prostitution in the last lesson, your wealthy males may not have visited the local brothels. They may have just looked to the slave women in their household. So there's also the idea from a historian that we'll talk about in class of potentially slave women moving up a little bit of a hierarchy of sorts by becoming their master's lovers. But I don't believe this is completely confirmed. Okay, here's some evidence. Here where we find a variety of evidence about women in terms of political graffiti, buildings, tombs, villas, epitaphs. This particular villa is a really, really famous one. I would actually say this is a particular example I would definitely try and keep in your memory bank for the HSC. So it's the house of Julia Felix. She is an incredibly wealthy woman who gets really rich, and then she actually rents out her property to other people. So she's essentially an ancient, Airbnb owner, essentially speaking. That you can see some of the pictures here. Really, really nice place that she rented out to other people as well. But we'll go over some more photos of her house in a future lesson. And this last bit of evidence here, this was a snake bracelet. I believe it had diamond eyes. It was found on the remains of a woman's arm who was taking shelter with a man. And the inscription reads, "From the master to his slave girl," which is a really kind of cringy kind of thing to think about, because a master giving their slave a gift wasn't necessarily common practice. So this kind of went with the idea, could slave girls become their master's lover and kind of get a little bit more favor and potentially move outside of being a slave. In class, we are really going to go over much more evidence and go into detail on the evidence, but these are just the bare basics of the social structure in Pompeii and Herculaneum.